Okay, cool. Well, welcome everybody to the Gibson House. My name is Sarah Bartlett. I am the museum curator for Yolo County. The current exhibition in the Gibson House is called Give Face. I encourage you all to explore it after the presentation if you haven't already. It's about the Chinese community in Yolo County, which is why I reached out to Professor Chin to come and talk to you guys about the Chinese restaurant project in the Chicago Cafe. Professor Chin is a distinguished professor of law and the director of the clinical legal education at UC Davis. He studies Asian American legal history and has done some really cool work with some of the restaurants, or one of the Chinese restaurants here in Woodland. So please take it away.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah.
It's a real pleasure to be with you all today and to have an opportunity to talk about this work. I'm a little embarrassed, though, because there are people here who you may spot who know a lot more about the Chicago Cafe than I do. The Chicago Cafe, according to my research, was the longest operating Chinese restaurant in the United States. I say was because they closed a month ago. We have not been able to identify the exact date when they opened, but we believe the best guess historically is 1903. So they were open from 1903 to 2025. The oldest continuously operating Chinese restaurant that I know of now is the Peking Noodle Parlors in Butte, Montana, that opened in 1911. I coincidentally was just there. Also an amazing place. This, as I assume all of you, if you're here, you probably have been on Main Street in Woodland. This is the Chicago Cafe. From the side, 411 East Main Street. The empty lot is 409 Main Street, the former location of the Chicago Cafe. These people are Mr. and Mrs. Fong, who operated the Chicago Cafe for many years, and we're privileged to have them with us today. There's Mr. Fong in the kitchen. So how do I know? What is it that makes me say that the Chicago Cafe was the oldest continuously operating Chinese restaurant in the United States? There's no Guinness Book of World Records for Chinese restaurants, and one of the things about Chinese restaurants is that they are, there's a couple of chains now that historically there weren't. They're isolated individual restaurants, they're individual entrepreneurial situations. How do I know? Well, as a scholar, I have to say I cannot be absolutely sure that it was the oldest, longest, continuously operating Chinese restaurant. But there is a group called the Chinese Restaurant Historical Foundation. It is a nonprofit that's associated with the Trade Association of Chinese restaurant owners. And a few years ago, they did a survey to try to find the longest operating Chinese restaurants in the United States. Sam Wo in San Francisco, they said, was number one, but Sam Wo was closed for a few years recently, and their claimed date of founding date of 1908, after 1903, is somewhat apocryphal. They say, well, it was after the earthquake and fire, but they don't say specific. The other one with a clear provenance is the Peking Noodle House, the Peking Noodle Parlor in Montana. They claim 1911, also after 1903. So I believe. Can you see that, by the way, or is that difficult to see? That's the San Francisco Chronicle, pictures of the restaurant. Chinese restaurant might be the oldest in the United States. Here's our evidence. This is the first recorded information about the Chicago Cafe. It is an ad from the Woodland Daily Democrat from August 20th of 1910. Chicago chop suey and noodle restaurant, 409 Main Street. And this is the first documented existence that we could find. And we did look at the Yolo County archives. We looked at some newspapers there that are not digitized. And by the way, when I say we, this is a project that I did with a bunch of law students and other graduate students at UC Davis. People who are interested in Chinese restaurants from a variety of perspectives: historical, culinary, economic. I worked with a wonderful team of students to try and explore this question, and some non-student consultants who have expertise in this area. And this is what we were able to find. August 20th, 1910, 409 Main Street. It moved to the Burns Hotel in 1919, which is on the site of the current Hotel Woodland. The hotel was torn down. They built a bigger, better hotel. And then at a certain point, it is 100 years ago or more, it's in 411 East Main Street. Here, the Chicago restaurant is put a little ad to the sort of civic participation to congratulate the Woodland Clinic Hospital from opening the town. As to the date, 1903, this is the best evidence we had. This is the Woodland Democrat from May 1940. It's an ad. It wasn't digitized, so I had to take a picture of a microfilm. So this is an ad that the restaurant posted in 1940. They say in 1940, we are Woodland's oldest restaurant, established in 1903, 37 years in operation. And our thinking is that in 1940, there were people who were adults in 1903 who were still around. And so it has, to that extent, some credibility, as maybe it actually was started then. And why lie? What would be the reason for making it up? In 1940, there were a bunch of big-time Chinese restaurants in New York and San Francisco, Port Arthur, in New York, the Pharisees in San Francisco, which closed in the last 10 years, that dated to the 1880s. So there's no sort of Guinness Book of World Records reason to fabricate 1903, because back then, 1903 wasn't such a big deal. So we take this as perhaps less than absolute proof that it was founded in 1903, but certainly reason enough to put it on a t-shirt. We see a few things in this ad. The Chicago Cafe, then and now, served American food as well as Chinese food. These restaurants were there to serve the community. These were not restaurants for fussy, principled celebrity chefs. These were jobs. People came to sell what the people of Woodland and elsewhere in Yolo County would buy. So So June, you could go to the Chicago Cafe and get a cheeseburger with potato chips, or you could get chop suey, whatever you want. Another thing about this is Chicago. And in our research, why Chicago? What does Chicago Cafe have to do with Chinese food? And one answer is, at least from our research in the ads, a lot of places all around, not just the country, but the world, there were Chinese restaurants called Chicago Cafe, Chicago Restaurant, something like that. And there were also ads for Chinese restaurants that said, our chef is from Chicago, not Shanghai, not Hong Kong, not Beijing, Chicago. And it seems clear that there was a significant period of time where Chicago had a reputation for having excellent Chinese food. So my thinking is that's why from 1910 and perhaps 1903, it was the Chicago Cafe and not something else, or Chicago Restaurant, Chicago Chop Suey, Noodle Parlor, or whatever. Another question that you might be asking is why couldn't we prove the existence of the Chicago Cafe in some form or another prior to 1910, which, as I said, is as far as we can go back, through city directories and things like that. And the answer is that back then, a lot of this, 1903, 1910, changed shortly thereafter. The Woodland city directories and other similar compilations of information didn't include Chinese residences for Chinese pizzas. That was not something that was part of the list. I'm sure you can't see this, but below the Chicago restaurant, on the right-hand side of the ad, is the phone number, and the phone number of the Chicago restaurant is 520. It's a 3-digit number, which is pretty long. So I became interested in the Chicago Cafe and in Chinese restaurants, in part because Chinese restaurants, I think, are part of American culture. I like Chinese food. I do not claim to be an expert on Chinese food or even Chinese restaurants. But I became interested in it because of the legal connection. And the legal connection is complicated, but it's this. So starting in 1790, we have a restriction on naturalized citizenship in the United States. The Constitution comes into effect in 1789. First Congress comes into office and starts doing things. And one of the first things they do is have a naturalization law because they want to encourage immigration. That was one of the complaints against King George III in the Declaration of Independence, is that he would not permit sufficient immigration to populate the United States and grow the United States. But there was a restriction in immigration, and that was to free white persons. And the what I will call anti-Asian racism was not just in Washington, D.C., it was not just in California, it was in Woodland also. So whether it's 1903 or 1910, the Chicago Cafe comes into existence in a difficult social environment. So here's an ad in the Woodland Daily Democrat from August 1st, 1907. Pop pickers wanted. No Japs or Chinese. So there's employment challenges. Here's an ad from the Woodland Daily Democrat, March 7th, 1910. The top is an ad for the Woodland Steam Laundry, and they give you a bunch of reasons why you should go to the Woodland Steam Laundry. And the answer, one of the reasons, is not the first reason, but the second reason, is we employ white help only, taking no chances from unclean methods. Now, if you roll down, you can't see it, but if you could see it, you would see an ad at the bottom for the Sunrise Laundry, dry cleaning, and which is run by people whose names seem Asian to me, Takamen and Hanaki. And so there are laundries run by Asians in Woodland at the time. But the Woodland Steam Laundry is saying come to a white owned and operated facility. Woodland Daily Democrat, March 4th, 1920. Beamer's Woodland Park is an advertisement for a new housing development. And by the way, my email is gjchin@ucdavis.edu or gjchin@ucdavis.edu. If you want me to send you these slides so you can see this stuff, I'd be happy to do it. Housing development, Beamer's Woodland Park, and in that small text towards the bottom is this. There's one restriction. These tracts will be sold to white people only, white outside and white inside. So this is a situation. The Del Mar Grill in Woodland advertises that if you go there, you're going to be served by all white help. And so the immigration of Asians to the United States in this period had both a set of economic and cultural critiques associated with it. So this is a leaflet by the famed labor leader Samuel Gompers. Some reasons for Chinese exclusion: meat versus rice, American manhood versus Asiatic hooliganism, which shall survive. 1902. And this, you can't see it at the top, but Samuel Gompers wrote this leaflet, and it was published as a Senate document in 1902, and that was part of the public policy debate. And the meat versus rice argument, concretely, was that Chinese people could survive on rice and could eat things that were inexpensive, whereas the dignified white worker deserves to have meat, better food, better living conditions. So there was racism aimed at Chinese, other Asians. At the same time, there was a fascination with Chinese food. Newspapers talk about the chop suey fad, chop suey craze. The picture there, two young flappers, I guess we would say, eating lunch, probably maybe working women. This is a hopper, and they are evidently eating at a Chinese restaurant because the sign outside says "Sui." So there was a fascination with Chinese food that ranged from young people slumming in Chinatowns, New York, San Francisco, Chicago, and elsewhere, to culinary, to foodies, what we would now call foodies, with a serious interest in Chinese food. And that attention existed in Woodland also. So this is the Woodland Daily Democrat from a bit before our period, 1896. The Chinese have more ways of cooking a chicken than we, with all our culinary philosophy, ever dreamed of. And that captures, in my view, something of the perceived exoticism of Chinese restaurants and Chinese food. It's back then far out, but also good, tasty. This is another article from the Woodland Daily Democrat. The Chinese are a nation of cooks. There is scarcely an individual in their vast community who is not more or less competent to cook himself a respectable dinner. The peasant sits down to dinner cooked by the hand of his wife or daughter-in-law. In large establishments, the cooks are invariably men. So you know, it's not completely contemptuous. Around the time of the founding of the Chicago Cafe was the biggest historical moment in the legal saga of Chinese restaurants. And that was this. A missionary, young female missionary, who was the granddaughter of a Civil War general. Her name is Elsie Siegel. Was working in Chinatown in New York as a missionary, teaching Sunday school and that sort of thing. And she had a boyfriend, Leon Ling was his name. And in 1909, Elsie Siegel was murdered, and it does look pretty likely that Leon Ling did it. And that created a significant moral panic across the country. You know, you have to be careful about when you listen to scholars talk about the significance of the things that they found. But this was a national case. This was a crime of the century type of situation. It was in the headlines everywhere for a long time. Pretty quickly, the Daily Democrat published an editorial. Murder Points to a Moral was the title, and some of the key suggestions from the Woodland Daily Democrat were, this case demonstrates so strikingly the danger to American girls and young women who undertake to inculcate Christianity in the hearts of the heathen Chinese. The peculiarities of the Oriental mind are far too deep to be fathomed by American men, to say nothing of American women and girls. There is ample opportunity for the expression of the missionary zeal among the poor and unfortunate of our own race. For years, the newspapers are filled with reports of Leon Ling, the murderer, who was never caught, being spotted everywhere and all across the country for years. Puerto Ricans and Japanese and Koreans and Chinese men are being grabbed. Police think they found Leon Ling in Portland, Oregon, or wherever. And they never did. They never did. It was the subject, you know, there was no internet at the time, as you know, it was television. But there were certain kinds of mass media. There were certain kinds of shared national, cultural avenues. And one of them was the theater. And there was a play that was quickly written. I have not been able to find a copy of the script. But there was a play called The Chinatown Trunk Mystery that played all across the country, played at the Woodland Opera House. Random ads from Baltimore and Detroit. It was a moral lesson about the dangers of white women and Chinese restaurants. And that translated into editorials about white women doing mission work to non-white groups, but also to Chinese restaurants themselves. And so Madeira Mercury reported in 1912, the impenetrable mask of Oriental silence allows nothing to escape of the unspeakable crimes that are committed in such dives. Headline is Chinese restaurants in Madeira. Beer and noodles in Chinese joints have caused the downfall of countless American girls. And so, I sort of, born in the civil rights era, born in '64. So this history, it never occurred to me that Chinese restaurants could be thought of as dens of vice and sin, but they were. That was a thing back then. Beer and noodles and Chinese joints. Here's the Chicago Tribune, sewage joints, dens of vice. This is 1915, I believe. More than 300 Chicago white girls have sacrificed themselves to the influence of the chop suey joints during the last year, according to police statistics. So the police kept statistics on the consequences of chop suey. Vanity and the desire for showy clothes led to their downfall, it was declared. It was accomplished only after they smoked and drank in the chop suey restaurants and permitted themselves to be hypnotized by the dreamy, seductive music that is always on top. So this is the Chicago Daily Tribune, right? This is mainstream media, not some fringe.
What are they saying happened to the girls?
They would go to these restaurants and hang out, not under the supervision of the white community. And these restaurants, Chinese immigrants at this point were predominantly not Christian. They were segregated in the ways that I alluded to. I have to say that in some places they did segregate their countrymen. In some places they participated in racial segregation and didn't allow, for example, African Americans to be with white Americans. But on the other hand, the reputation of Chinese restaurants in 1900, 1910, 1920 was as of much freer places. The sketches, we don't really have candid photographs, but the sketches, the drawings in the newspapers at the time were what we would now call more diverse. They have a little bit of the feel of jazz clubs or something, where different people can go there and do their thing. And the Chinese restaurant people aren't going to say, it's no time for you to go home. So I think what they're talking about specifically is sexual relations outside of marriage, and in some cases, drinking, smoking, taking drugs. So the anxiety about Chinese restaurants turned into various kinds of calls for action. This is a resolution from the chair of the Committee on Asiatics of the Hotel and Restaurant Employees International Alliance and Bartenders International League, the union. And in their 1915 annual meeting in San Francisco, they said, whereas Chinese and Japanese restaurants and Chinese laundries give no employment to American labor, well, they give employment to some American labor, maybe not as much white American labor. Whereas the above places are in competition with our American employers, resolved that we, the delegates to this 18th General Convention, urge our membership to refrain from patronizing the above mentioned places. So there were boycotts. It goes on. The resolution goes on to say that union members who patronize Chinese or Japanese restaurants, I don't know why the Japanese got something to this. Celsius and no Japanese boyfriend. But there was sort of a tendency to treat all Asians as identical in this period. So the unions proposed to boycott Chinese and Japanese establishments, to fine their members who went there. There were some union members who said, why don't we bring the Chinese workers and Japanese workers into the union? That was an argument that was sometimes made, but it never succeeded until some decades later. By the 1940s, you see that. But in the early part of the 20th century, the American Federation of Labor, the 1913 convention, said passed this resolution, whereas the evils arising from the employment of white women and girls in establishments owned or controlled by Chinese and Japanese constitute both morally and economically a serious menace to society. Therefore, be it resolved that the American Federation of Labor be requested to pledge its best endeavors to secure the passage of a law prohibiting the employment of white women or girls in all such establishments. So, in a bunch of states around the country and cities, there were proposals to prohibit white women from working in and living in Chinese restaurants. The conclusion of legal authorities, like the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, was that these laws were unconstitutional, given the 14th Amendment. But there was nevertheless a lot of enthusiasm for them, a lot of discussion of them. Salem, Oregon, in 1910, passed an ordinance regulating Chinese and Japanese noodle restaurants, and they did two things. They said, you can't have locked out windows with booths. I'm not talking about like those red leather booths that they had in steakhouses. I'm talking about the kind of booths that used to be the custom in Chinese restaurants, that were little cubicles that would have a door or a curtain, and you could actually close it off and be in your own little room. And the concern was that anything could happen in those little rooms: drinking, sexual misconduct, etc. And one of the things that I appreciated about the Chicago Cafe is that again, I don't claim to be an expert on Chinese restaurants, but I do go wherever I can. The Chicago Cafe still has the old style booths that close off. Also the Far East Cafe in San Francisco, Grant Street, and the Community Parlors in Woodland. Next time you go to San Francisco, go check it out and see what I'm talking about. I don't think that they encourage you to do anything wrong in there, but that was the idea. So there were ordinances, laws passed all around the country, saying you can't have a little bit it's clear that the reason for that were to target Chinese and Japanese restaurants. This ordinance in Salem, Oregon is a nice example of that because it doesn't say no restaurant can have little booths. It says Chinese and Japanese restaurants can have little booths. So that's section 1 is the little booths. Section 2 is a curfew for minors, again, in Chinese and Japanese restaurants. San Francisco seriously considered doing one of these things, but they didn't. This is the opinion of the San Francisco City Attorney from 1913. The Board of Health respectfully requests that the City Attorney submit an opinion as to whether or not an ordinance designed to prohibit the employment of females in Greek restaurants and the employment of white women in Chinese chop suey houses would be legal. And if it would be legal to attempt the enactment of such legislation, what mode of procedure should be followed? And the opinion said you can't prohibit women from working in Greek restaurants. That would violate the protection clause of the 14th Amendment. It's discriminatory. However, as to Chinese restaurants, the answer was different. the proposed legislation being applicable to white women only, admitting of a racial distinction for the purpose of classification, if it appears that such places as generally operated are against the welfare of white women, it is more than probable that the constitutionality of the legislation as to them would be upheld on the ground of a reasonable exercise of the police power. Lots of these things were proposed and in some cases enacted. This is the Los Angeles Times. Citizens' hands across the bar, only American employees and civilians, says police commission. They proposed to only allow citizens to work in bars. The LA Times says this change, which is designed to do away with the employment of Orientals in saloons and restaurants that give their places to citizens, will be made by the police commission. I don't think this actually came into force. But things like this, Los Angeles Herald, chief keeps watch on Chinese cafes. Complaints have been made to the police that white women are employed in Chinese restaurants in Los Angeles, and Chief Sebastian has been asked to take steps to prevent this. If the police choose to employ special enforcement methods against anyone, they can find healthcare violations, other legal violations. There's a lot of laws out there, and if they're paying special attention to Chinese cafes, they need to be made to suffer. This is Minnesota news report, a Chicago law that was designed to take advantage of the fact that Chinese couldn't naturalize. So they passed a law saying you have to be a citizen to have a restaurant in Chicago. This, I don't think, passed either. It was discussed. So the laws against Chinese restaurants obviously didn't work, but they were part of a sort of public policy hubbub that did work. So we have the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. Chinese exclusion was made permanent in 1902. Japanese immigrants are restricted in 1907, 1908. Asian Indians are excluded in 1917. We talked about the restriction on naturalization. And in 1924, the connection between the right to immigrate and the right to naturalize became direct. And if people weren't allowed to naturalize, because they weren't among the folks who were given privilege of naturalization for their race, they weren't allowed to immigrate at all. So aliens ineligible to citizenship are excluded in 1924. On the other hand, there are exceptions. Scholars, students, and importantly for this story, merchants. Merchants are allowed to immigrate. And a scholar named Heather Lee, who was at NYU Shanghai, has written about what's been called the lo mein loophole. And in the earlier years, there was a question as to whether a Chinese restaurant owner was a manual laborer, excluded, or a merchant, admitted. Chinese exclusion was calibrated, not to interfere with international trade, which in 1882, 1868, the 14th Amendment was passed, in 1884, throughout our period, and now international trade is important. And so merchants were given an exception. And after 1915, it was clear that a Chinese restaurant owner, whose duties are solely those of the manager, is a merchant. So a number of people across the country were able to come to the United States as merchants to operate Chinese restaurants. Nevertheless, I want to say overall, the hostility to Chinese restaurants, which was part of this larger economic and cultural opposition to non-white immigration, was, in my view, and here, I do claim to be an expert on the history of Asian immigration, something that I've written about for some years. I would say it is one of the most effective public policy initiatives that's ever been undertaken by the United States. Why? Well, because in 1882 and 2025, half of the world's population is Asian. The United States is a nation of immigrants, but as late as 1960, the 1960 census, less than 0.5% of the U.S. population was Asian, and that was not because of a lack of immigration from Asia, not because of a lack of desire of Asians to immigrate to the United States, but because of the rigorous effectiveness of the Asian exclusion policy. It's also, I would say, and this is an argument, a proposition, one of the forms of racial discrimination has been the most systematically reversed. Because in 1965, thanks to the Immigration and Nationality Act amendments of 1965, which were imagined by President Kennedy and carried forward by Senator Edward Kennedy, but primarily probably by President Johnson, we got rid of the anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, anti-Asian features of immigration law. And after 1965, immigration visas were awarded based on family connections to people already in the United States and job qualifications. Because there were so few Asians in the United States, at the time, Asians did not immigrate based on family identification, but they immigrated based on being students, scholars, merchants, and other educational skills. And now, from 0.5% in 1960, without any racial preference, right, with neutral immigration policy based on demand and skill and what the law says is desirable, the Asian population is something like 6% of the United States. Still much smaller than it would have been, but another way to look at those statistics is that until 1965, about 80%, 85% of the immigrant stream were white. Since 1965, about the same proportion has been non-white, either Asian, African, Latin American, South American, etc. And again, it's because of these race-neutral qualifications established by Congress, not because of affirmative action. But places like the Chicago Cafe provided a lifeline during the period of the most rigorous exclusion. And you see things like this, which is a draft registration card from World War II. And a person named Mong Him Fong says his place of residence is 411 Main Street. Says his place of work is the Chicago restaurant, which we know is at 411 Main Street. The person who will always know where he is Yu Fong at 411 Main Street. And so I believe Mon Him Fong is a cousin of the Fongs, or maybe an uncle of this generation. But the 411 Main Street provided a place for him to live and work. If you picture the Chicago Cafe in your mind, So you see the brick part, and then you see a little concrete part, and then behind that is a parking lot. But before it was a parking lot, it was the last building of the old Woodland Chinatown, and it was a dwelling. And I've heard about it from the Fong kids, and it had a wooden floor, not a dirt floor like some of the residences in China, but people lived there. And I believe that Mr. and Mrs. Fong's parents lived there at one time. There's a shower in the bathroom area of the Chicago Cafe. And so I think the building, the institution, provided a legal method of some Fongs to move to the United States when they otherwise couldn't. It provided employment that might otherwise have been unavailable. It provided an actual place to live for many, many years. The end of the story is, as I told you at the beginning, the Chicago Cafe is closed, and I'm sad about that. That's unfortunate because I wish it could have stayed in existence for another 100 years. But we had multiple generations of the Fong family that had come over and worked in the restaurant, and Mr. and Mrs. Fong's children, Amy Fong and Andy Fong, were told, and they've spoken about this publicly, I'm not disclosing private family information. They are, Amy and Andy are adults now, the children are grown. They grew up in the restaurant, and when they were there, they worked there. And I was told that at some point during their high school years, Mr. and Mrs. Fong said, "You don't have to take over the restaurant when you graduate from high school. You can go to college and do whatever you want." Well, maybe they didn't say whatever you want, but you don't have to work at the restaurant. And Amy went to Northwestern and is a PhD in physical therapist. And Andy works in Silicon Valley. Amy talked with her about her life growing up in the restaurant on an episode of Insight, Public Radio, and that's on if you want to look that up. And Andy is involved in an organization called Friends of Roots, which helps American Chinese find their communities and ancestors back in China. So they're working hard and doing well, and they have children of their own who, of course, have been to the restaurant. And I think what happened. This is an ad from the Chicago restaurant from, I believe, 1911. Meals day and night. They didn't want to make meals day and night. They wanted to do something else. I asked Mr. and Mrs. Fong, how come you closed on Tuesdays? Before they closed permanently, they closed a couple of days a week. And they told me, "Don't worry, on our days off, we are shopping for food, we're doing the things we have to do to keep the restaurant running." And if you're serving meals day and night, as the Chicago Cafe did for many years, it's a tough road to hoe. And my joke is, but I think it has a grain of truth in it, is that one of the reasons that you have a Chinese restaurant is so your kids don't have to work in a Chinese restaurant. So the restaurant is closed, but it has done, in my view, it's heroic work, and it's a very important part of Woodland and California, U.S. history. There's more about Chicago Cafe if you want to hear about it. There's a multimedia display. There's a paper that covers a lot of the material that I wrote, that I just shared with you, which is available for free online. Beth Wettergreen wrote a wonderful paper over a decade ago. Gives more details about the farm family. So with that, I'll stop. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.